I want to begin with something that you in Michigan might not find all that surprising, which is that I shovel snow. And in Vancouver, where I live, we don't have to do it very often. And oftentimes we are able to simply wait for the rains to show up and wash away the snow, and then go about our merry business and wait for spring to come in February. But in a part of my community, our neighborhood has a program called Snow Angels. And as part of that program, I get a list of a number of seniors whose front yards I shovel with my son. And I've enjoyed doing it. It's no problem doing it. But it has been revelatory in so many ways to confirm for me the challenge that we face in terms of the way that our built environment either enables or disables people. And this became really clear in the story of Maria. Maria is one of the four women that I shovel for. And she was crossing a street from the village core back to her home at the crosswalk with the flashing lights when she was plowed into by a driver driving at speed, but into her without her being able to do anything in response. She's a senior. Her life was immediately upended by this action. She was harmed by a negligent driver and confronted with her new disability, her body being broken in this way. She was now facing the disability that comes from the way that we've built our built environment. And it was somewhat troubling or challenging for me because she would apologize that she wasn't able to do the work of clearing her front driveway. And yet I saw for her the new challenges that she faced on a daily basis to navigate a world that suddenly had become so much more hostile to her. She was no longer driving. She had no expectations that she would be able to drive. She was fearful of going out onto roadways, and yet that was her only option, even within a village, because we had not for generations provided the basic things like either a sidewalk or a commitment to slow neighborhood streets. She was disabled physically, yes, by her injuries and also by the effects of her aging, but she was also disabled by the built environment around her. She could walk, as I met her, within limits, but she didn't trust herself to go out onto the streets without sidewalks. She had no separated side paths to connect her home to the village core where all of her supplies were. And on top of that, the psychological trauma of being struck was still on her mind. The feeling of being pinned by a vehicle, of being plowed into and then pinned by a vehicle, was fresh for her, barring the way to her full participation in her community. Here was a person restricted by health issues. That's fairly common. People in various periods of their lives face this type of disability where health issues will limit one's abilities in various ways. She was also restricted by the hazards introduced by snow, temporary, 2 weeks, tops. But more profoundly, she was restricted by a built environment that showed a different face when she ceased to drive. And that's what I want to talk about this evening with you, because you face this where you live as well. A built environment that disables rather than enables people to live and thrive and prosper where they live. I watched a recap of last year's Walk Bike Washtenaw County meeting. And in that meeting, your presenter talked about the mindset shift that needs to occur to reframe how people think about the death toll and trauma attributed to crashes on our streets, roads, and highways. We're quick to say, so-and-so was not a statistic. Maria is not a statistic, and yet we shrug at the thought of a senior citizen being struck by a vehicle in a crosswalk with lights flashing and just simply go on and say, well, let's see what happens next. As Councilmember Kathy Griswold said after the presentation last year, I'm on council right now, and there's a lot of pressure right now to deliver safer solutions. And she shared that there's a new city administrator, and she was hopeful that he would be more involved in the operations and ready to act. I also read about your community that A2 Safe Transport was formed after the death of a local high schooler who was struck and killed while crossing Fuller Road near Huron Parkway in late 2016. And so after that galvanizing tragedy, resulting in a new group forming and other actions being taken, you could in some way say that what I can offer you as an outsider tonight is a 6-year check-in on your progress in Ann Arbor. Are you making changes to the built environment to enable seniors, children, those without vehicles, those who are made vulnerable by the built environment in your city? Are you making changes to enable them to participate fully in so many more things? There was a newspaper article about the efforts that were being made in your community, and someone named Stephanie Preston was quoted. She said, "The city has enough money. You need to implement some safe crosswalks," she said, in response to a report that had come out that offered no further solutions. She said, "We have the money, we just need to do it. It doesn't need another step of study and processes and grants. We don't want any more studies. We want crosswalks to be improved. Please put it in the next budget cycle." And she's not alone. In our community, many communities, this is a common refrain, but her words were strong, weren't they? We don't want more studies. We want crosswalks. 6 years later, from when this teenager was struck and killed, has your city administration concretely changed your city? Literally, in some cases, by identifying gaps in sidewalks and filling them with concrete, or using concrete to form barricades and to increase at targeted intersections the pedestrian safety and the viability for those that are using the street in non-motorized ways. And so tonight I want to go through this question. The item on the left is not from your city, but the item on the right is. And we have this to say, that shame is not a suitable solution. Telling people to simply stop doing something, to never walk unless the right signal is shown, or to make eye contact, not body contact, almost said with a glibness, to be sure that drivers see you before crossing the street. Isn't that an impossible demand? Eye contact with drivers. I've seen the way that some of the vehicles are tinted in Michigan. I've known what it's like as a driver to not fully be able to see where a pedestrian is. Making an impossible demand is not a solution. My sister-in-law wrote an article about this, and she said, if some stop for you, but not all, you're not safe. If most slow for you, but not all, you're not safe. If, whether you are present or not, automobiles slowly pass by, you are safe. This is how we go about changing this pattern. This is how we go about changing what people experience on a day-to-day basis. This is how we enable rather than disable. It is by changing the built environment so that vehicles at key places will pass slowly by rather than requiring on them to have eye contact with you or you to make sure that you step out at just the right moment so you're not struck and disabled. What does it mean to be disabled by the built environment? I say we can be actively disabled by design standards, or, as is even more common, surreptitiously disabled by reinforced assumptions about safety and vulnerability. Let me explain that a moment. In the background of this is a picture from River Road in my community. And it's on the route that my son and I bike along when we go to his school if we pick up another boy. Robbie loves to go biking with us, and yet this spot on the road terrifies me. Why is it that the hydro pole is there and not on the street? There could be a small little bump out, which ironically would slow the vehicles that pose the greatest threat to us. You can see it in the distance, the garbage truck coming up. What you can't see in the photo is that there's a curve just before this. And yet here in this moment, a work crew, by means of a design standard, said, yep, this is exactly where this pole belongs. And the repaving crew said, yep, this is exactly how we repave this section of the road. Disabling anyone pushing a stroller. My son will ride on the left side unless I yell at him, or else on the right side of that post. And yet both times I feel this great threat in my heart where I wonder, is he going to clip his handlebar and get sent spilling onto the road. That's another form of disability, isn't it? And certainly the opposite of being enabled. He is being surreptitiously disabled because his I would say, just protective father is saying, I don't think I want you to be doing this route regularly. And that's what I mean about these reinforced assumptions about safety and vulnerability. And the challenge is, I think Fred will be presenting some stats, some reports, and update on studies that are being done. And yet what we don't see is often so critical as well. How many people are choosing not to go by this path? And this is no exception. It's everywhere, isn't it? I'm sure Ann Arbor has many places like this as well. When people choose not to do something, they are invisibly doing so. And yet their lives are shaped by this exclusion. Maria, who I talked about just a little bit earlier, lives just 2 blocks over from this place, and would, when she was passing through on her way to the village, have passed through at this key juncture. Now, for many reasons, she does not move on foot to get throughout the village, and yet this pole is a clear example of how our city and our practices are set up in such a way to prevent many of the types of trips, many of the types of movements that otherwise would occur. But it's not all bleak. Action can be taken at low cost. Action can be taken at low cost. I love the image on the left in Sydney, Australia, little potted plants used to demarcate a new use of a space. After all, the street is ours. Let's use it as we see fit. And you can tell, evidently, there's enough space for vehicles to still use that area, and yet now for cyclists, including children, to pass by. Or the image in the background there. They're garbage cans. Stick them in the way, and you create a new opportunity. And there you see in the middle a vehicle set there as a parked object, a parked hulking mass of steel and aluminum and rubber protecting this new pop-up bike lane. Action can be taken at low cost, and this is where I want to offer a suggestion for you as an advocacy organization. Start with something, whether potted plants or garbage cans, before graduating to full installations. Reach out to your city council members, your administrators, others that will listen, with pictures, with identified segments. Say, can we do it here? Plan demonstration events. Under this heading, make the good visible before you make it permanent. The roadway industry is capable of getting an entire highway interface constructed from a set of drawings. They don't have to display it ahead of time. They don't have to create it with cones first. They just do it because these are entrenched behaviors. But as we try to change the built environment with new forms of behaviors, new forms of construction, we need to make the good visible. And you do that through these types of pop-up demonstrations. Make it visible even before you make it permanent. That way you can learn from any mistakes. You can figure out, oh, that wasn't the optimal setting for that. No problem, we'll move the garbage can. And so 6 years later, this high schooler was struck and killed. Is Ann Arbor taking the lead and installing what I like to call slow lane installations rather than bike lanes? No, they're slow lanes. They can be used by many different forms of transportation. People running or jogging, people on electric scooters or just regular scooters, people rollerblading, slow lane installations. And again, make the good visible before you make it permanent, like here on Hornby Street in Vancouver, where they've gone and actually made it permanent. And I'll tell you what, it's wonderful. And also to think about, how do we find ways to open our streets? We talk about road diets. And I understand there's reasons for wanting to think, oh, we're slimming down the lanes or we're doing other things that resemble a diet. But who voluntarily signs up for a diet? No, we are opening the streets. We are making them, enabling them for people of many different uses. We are making them more productive. That's what it is to have open streets, not to have a road that is stuck, poor sap, on a diet. Do we enable or disable? We do this in our built environment all the time, don't we? To enable construction of new housing in Ann Arbor, major changes have been made to University Avenue. I went and took a look on Google Maps, and you can see quite plainly they have taken an entire traffic lane and just made it not a traffic lane. So you can take that to your city council and say, I know you can do it. I know that you can do it. Construction crews run pilot projects every day within the built environment. And so the question is, why not for transportation, or we can say, why not for active transportation or enabling transportation projects? Try it. If they can close this lane for weeks on end, if not months, and this is a road that has a bus route on it, is a fairly vibrant, bustling activity. Notice that truck has more space than the pedestrians that are crossing there, but I digress. 6 years later, is your city taking any action to reduce lane widths? We use this image at Strong Towns often. Both of these pictures are 20-mile-per-hour zones, but only one of them is designed like it. Each of them might have a sign saying 20 miles per hour. But guess which one actually feels like a 20-mile-per-hour street? We need to reduce our lane widths and do so in many different ways. Do so with, like I said, potted plants. Do so with little pop-up chunks of plywood. Get the community involved. Temporary retrofits. Say, let's do it for the month of July and August. We'll narrow some of our roadways in order to then open up the streets for other uses. In part, to give our sidewalks a bit of relief where sidewalks do exist. Especially during the pandemic, we noticed in our community, but I'm sure it was widespread, that sidewalks became contested space because cyclists wanted to use them, rollerbladers wanted to use them, and yet they were prevented. And some of the more forward-thinking municipalities said, well, we'll take a little bit of roadway. But oh, what a tragedy it is that even those small advances were then reversed so quickly and without as much as a murmur. Also at Strong Towns, we say if you need a sign to tell people to slow down, you designed the street wrong. This is why it's so essential to understand that it is the built environment, the way that it is, the wood, the trees, the grass, the concrete, and the asphalt that determines the actions of people far more than what we might do through campaigns, through speed studies, through signs, through shaming campaigns, all of those types of things. Build a better environment. Do so with things like curb extensions. These are ones as they've been built in, made permanent, and yet they can be done with cones. Narrow the intersections quickly with cones, and then eventually with more permanent installations. And notice the one on the right is one that I am especially a fan of. It captures rainwater to hold it for longer, so that way your storm sewers are benefiting. It holds a place for trees as well as for other grasses and other growing things, so that way you have in time the shade that will bring. They've even added seating, and they've made that seating into something more fortified, so that those that sit on that seating facing towards the buildings, towards the places where people gather, are protected from the passing vehicles nearby. And this one also gets points for having these bollards here, further protecting people. Or here you have it in other forms, having a sign as well as a neighborhood box or a mailbox and all of the other items that help people to say, I feel safe here. Notice how much narrower this road has become through this simple curb extension. What about neighborhood roundabouts? The one on the left is out of Utah. This was a hack job, a tactical urbanism job where members of the community got together with chalk and created their own roundabout to disrupt the speedway and turn it back into a neighborhood street. And these things work. You can see on the left a more established version of it in Vancouver, and yet these are the ways that we are able to change our built environment, and in so doing, enable many, many different forms of active transportation. I love these. These are simple, modest, yellow, awesome blocks of awesome. The city of Calgary produces them themselves. They are stackable, movable, and deployable by city works crews, and yet they allow rapid installation of enabling improvements. to make crossings easier for walking and rolling. I was struck by the fact that we talk about traffic calming, but let's talk about enabling transportation options, not calming the vehicles, but enabling the people. And guess what? When you put your emphasis and your focus not on slowing the cars as the only goal, but actually on enabling people to do many diverse forms of movement and gathering on your streets and on your places, what will happen is that drivers will slow. When you install these yellow curbs or curbside extensions or whatever it looks like, you will see a speed slow. Narrowing intersections, narrowing crossings, narrowing streets, these will enable many more users. What about mid-block crossings? The sweeping curves of suburbia, parkways that offer no picnics nor peace, boulevards where none may stroll. What about a mid-block crossing? Did a little bit of sleuthing on Google. I couldn't come visit you in Ann Arbor, but I could by Google Maps, and I noticed that just a short distance from the university on Washtenaw Avenue, which is why I picked this one, there's a half-mile stretch between marked crossings. A half a mile. The presumption being that if anyone is walking in any of these places where there's all sorts of other activities going on, student gatherings, all of that, that this idea is that this is a moat and no one may cross except here and here. Remember the sign saying, don't cross unless it says to cross. Well, that requires that you cross at those crossings. Here, for example, at Midway Point, the most logical place for there to be a crossing, there's none. You can cross 1/4 of a mile in either direction, but not here. And if you do cross here, you'll be blamed if you're struck and killed. I love this sign. Well, I don't love it, but the sign reinforces. I actually saw the sign and thought, oh, did I miss a crossing? But no, that sign's not there to designate that people are crossing at this place. No, it's saying they're over there on the sidewalk. So that way the driver is capable of passing on through. Don't you think this particular location on Washtenaw Avenue would be a perfect demonstration project by, say, an advocacy organization caring about these types of things in Washtenaw County? I mean, if you know of any, this might be one location for that. Now this I love. This is truly something to celebrate. I found this on your website. This is something to build upon. A walking map, just creating a literacy within your community of places that connect to other places by means of walking or cycling or rolling. In our community, we have a cycling advocacy organization that I'm a part of called Hub Cycling. And every year we have a big campaign called Ungap the Map. Ungap the Map. And the idea of it is to fundraise in order to provide ways to create the missing links. Find ways to ungap the map so that way there are more through lines. There are some awesome long lines there, but you need so much more before walking and active transportation become commonplace as a means of getting around. Maybe fine for recreation, which we'll touch on in a little bit, but it's different when it is in this form. 6 years later, do you have bollards installed at intersections as a way of preserving people's integrity so that way they don't need to stand at some distance away from an intersection, but rather can be up close to it and then ready to go when the intersection changes? I especially like this design. Benches integrated into it so that way when you face away from the street, you have an entire massive concrete block behind you. Or this one right here. This is in Steveston Village in my neighborhood. It has a rather robust and sturdy post. And then they just made it whimsical by adding a bit of rope. And yet I stand there with my son behind it and I feel secure. I feel welcomed. I feel enabled. And it didn't cost the city very much at all. 6 years later, is Ann Arbor prepared to adapt leading pedestrian intervals? We've been able to do this for years with existing technology in our signalized intersections. And I love its simplicity because this image describes exactly what it requires. 1, vehicles have to wait on red so that 2, pedestrians and cyclists get a head start. The results of this, the stats on the improvement in safety and well-being are astounding. And what I love about it is it enables people to get from place to place, even with a modicum of more of dignity, with being respected, being welcomed into the street through the intersection, even in advance of vehicles. And critically, so that way, when someone is parked at a light, they will remain for a little while longer before making that right-hand turn into the place where pedestrians are about to step out onto the curb. We know these choke points, we know these crisis moments, and so we need to decide, are we going to enable or disable people? And that's the core. We decide who is enabled and disabled. We can adapt our built environment to be less disabling. We all cope with differing disabilities. I wear glasses as a means of overcoming one. I try to work out as a means of overcoming stiffness and other things, and yet we all have differing disabilities. Children aren't the best decision makers when it comes to their own personal safety. Therefore, we need to adapt our built environment to be less disabling to them, providing safe routes to schools, allowing them to bike, providing for them. And so are we resigned to where things are and just as they will always be? Or will we take small steps? At Strong Towns, we talk about our 4-step process for public investment, and I'll share that with you afterwards in a PDF that I'll share with you. But here we urge everyone to humbly identify where your community is struggling. Humbly identify where your community struggles, and then address what can be done next. What is the first smallest thing that you can do? And then do it, and then repeat it. And by doing so, it means that after 6 years of inaction, more can be done within a year than had previously been done in past years. Once you begin to build momentum, you begin to see that these things can happen. 6 years later, we would consider accepting the status quo if the outcomes were on the whole better. Thought about that as I was preparing this, that we really could consider accepting the status quo if the outcomes were on the whole better. That would be the rational decision. But they're not. They're not socially, as we deal with way more isolation and struggles and people struggling to deal with one another. It's not good for public health. The outcomes, especially for us in Canada, where we are our neighbor's keeper, and so we want everyone to be healthy for as long as possible, because we have a single payer system. And so we want, and we actually see and reap the benefits when we are healthier and more enabled. And the status quo doesn't provide that. It's not healthy for public finances. And it's not healthy for private finances either. To address this, one of the things I want to share with you tonight is about the crash analysis studio that Strong Towns is launching in January. The intention is to provide a new standard of care for traffic fatalities. The studio will source and find traumatic collisions from citizens all around North America, and then bring together a panel of technical and non-technical experts for a video discussion of the crash. The intention is that we go beyond merely blaming a crash victim for wearing a dark coat, and instead analyzing the multiple factors that caused the crash, and subsequently to identify what can be done to reduce the frequency and trauma of future crashes. It's modeled on what the medical profession does. Instead of assigning blame, they seek to learn, improve, and reduce adverse outcomes over time. If there was a medication mix-up, they would say, let's make sure that there is clear labeling and even use different colored bottles. If someone's leg was taken and it was supposed to be the other one, make sure you don't just rely upon them giving you a thumbs up when you tap them on the leg to ask if that's the one that you want them to take. Have robust, rigorous systems in place. And yet when it comes to traffic fatalities and people dying in crashes all over the place, we say, well, it's just what happens. But it's not. We can change this. It's time we do the same. And so the 3 things that we are looking to do is have people nominate crashes so that they could be analyzed in part of a studio production, then learn how street design and other factors contributed to that crash and how they can be addressed. And then third, fix it. Get to it, connect with others to make your streets safer and more productive. Because the reality is that enabling mass adoption of the automobile, the personal private automobile, requires disabling mass adoption of transportation alternatives. Now, this is a separate talk that I could give as well, but enabling mass adoption of the automobile, if that becomes the default standard and the assumption that we will always have this and only this, it actually does disable mass adoption of transportation alternatives. Roads become contested spaces in ways that prohibit new transit projects or new crossings. People balk at the idea of introducing a new signalized intersection to allow people to cross safely. Or, as I hear in Ann Arbor, they fight over bike lanes and dismiss them as unnecessary and a destruction of what they value. Enabling, on the other hand, mass adoption of transportation alternatives requires a built environment that is adapted to new, although I would say old, values of safety and beauty. We model our systems on the assumptions and the values of speed and volume. That's how our traffic engineering systems are designed and weighted. And yet, as citizens, what we want is safety and beauty. We want the ability to enjoy and experience our environments at various speeds and various modes, and often to be able to just gather. And we want to do so in a way that is safe. And so we need to move towards that in the way that we design and build our neighborhoods and the way that we build our built environment. And so I'll conclude with this as an example, that we must make better investments. We have to change the environment, and you will change the transportation decisions which are made. And I think of this, the image on the right is of a redesign of a small baseball field in my community. And it was brought to the city council, and there was a lot of talk. Oh, it's beautiful, it's wonderful. And look, 100 spots for vehicles, more than previously. And I wrote in, I'm a bit of a gadfly this way. I said, where are the bike parking spots? Why is it that in a town that is flat, in a town that is quite constrained, about 25,000 people live here, lots of cycling going on, and yet on the way to the ballpark and at the ballpark, there is no place to park a bike, lock a stroller, stick an e-bike, safely store your wheelchair, whatever it is that you would use as an alternative to vehicles. And the response was, well, I guess we hadn't thought about that. I said, it's been 6 years as one metric in your community, but it's been that long and longer in my community as well, when we've had to deal with so many things to think, how do we have people make different decisions? We have to change the built environment. And so my proposal to them, and I really hope they do this, is to have at least 100 bike parking spaces where you can safely secure your bicycle, in order to demonstrate our commitment that this is what we will do. We will change our environment. And in so doing, we will enable many others to do what is needed. And so I want to open it up then at this point to the rest of you. I have a question, and I'll leave it up to the Walk Bike folks to decide. We can either go into a breakout session to talk about this in smaller groups, or just take it up as a big group. But my question for you is, what does an enabling built environment look like in Ann Arbor? And try to be specific. What is it that you would want to see changed? That's what I want to leave you with. Thank you so much for having me. It's been wonderful to join you. And next time that I'm in Michigan, I will make sure that I stop at in Ann Arbor. So good to be with you all. Thank you.